This wee bit. For our devotion this evening, we're going to be reflecting on Isaiah chapter 9. Actually, over the next few Wednesdays, we're going to be in Isaiah 9. It's such a wonderful text to meditate on during the Advent season. We'll all be quite familiar with it, I'm sure, but over the next 3 Wednesdays or so, we're just going to camp out here and spend some time pondering the truths in this section. For our Wednesday devotions over the past couple of months, we'll be looking at different names used for Jesus right across Scripture. And this chapter is just full of wonderful names for Jesus. But this is really going to be an introductory week. So let me read Isaiah 9, verses 1 to 7, and then I'll share some thoughts on it. And that'll set up our time of sharing and praying together. So Isaiah 9, verse 1. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you, as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. The main purpose of this Old Testament prophecy about the coming of Jesus was to give people hope in the midst of dark and gloomy circumstances. The hope in these verses centers on the coming into the world of Jesus Christ as a light coming into gloomy darkness. Why I wanted us to spend time focusing on this passage is because I think in the midst of all of our own gloomy darkness at the moment, I think we need to be confronted continually with the hope of Jesus Christ, the hope that Jesus brings into the world. Today I heard it said of the vaccine that's coming, the great news of the vaccine that's coming. I heard it said that this is the hope for the whole world. And I just stopped in my tracks and I thought, oh, we have a deeper hope for the whole world that doesn't just treat a symptom of fallenness, as we were thinking about on Sunday morning. This hope goes right to the source of all of our deepest hurts. Jesus is the genuine, real hope for the whole world. And so there's 3 observations that I want to make of the first 6 verses of Isaiah 9 that are really important for us to see if we're going to get the main message of Isaiah 9. First, we need to see the backdrop of darkness in these verses and what that darkness represents. At the end of chapter 8, and the start of chapter 9 in Isaiah, we see reference made to very real darkness that the people were experiencing back in Isaiah's day. Now, the darkness was metaphorically speaking of the people's fear and insecurity. In Isaiah 7, we read of a coalition, or we read of a coalition in the form of two northern kings that were preparing to invade the people in the south, among whom Isaiah is living. And the Israelites were struggling to trust God with their fear, and they were looking elsewhere for help to other nations who could maybe come in and rescue them from the armies that were causing them such fear and insecurity. And God spoke to the people saying, ultimately, if you turn away from me, you're not going to find hope. You're only going to know more darkness and fear. So if you look at how the end of chapter 8 ends in verse 22, and they will look to the earth, but behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish. They will be thrust into thick darkness. So the people were living with this big cloud over them, possible threat of invasion. They were feeling fearful and they were feeling intimidated. And here it's depicted as just gloom and darkness. And if they don't turn to the Lord and they turn to other things to try and help them with their gloom and darkness, they're only going to know more gloom and darkness. You could say that the people back then had a real darkness problem. And this is a summary again of life in a fallen world. We all have a darkness problem. The world is broken. There are challenges and difficulties all around us, often. Right now, it's the longevity of the COVID-19 crisis, the isolation we're all feeling, the uncertainty around us, the loneliness. It all breeds insecurity. It's very difficult to navigate. The darkness problem represents all of the difficulties that come with living in a world of brokenness, fallenness, where things don't always go the way they're supposed to. So it's really important as we read Isaiah 9 that first of all we understand that original context, the gloom, the darkness, the insecurity, and the fear. The reality of living in a broken, fallen world, Isaiah metaphorically speaks of it as darkness. So the people were feeling the darkness keenly. Second thing we need to see about Isaiah 9 is, though, that God is promising here that he's going to do something about the darkness problem, everything that causes the darkness and the fear and the insecurity. Look at chapter 9, verse 1. God opens the chapter saying, "But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time, he's made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan." Verse 2, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them a light has shined. So in verses 3 to 5, then, the light coming into the darkness metaphor is unpacked. And we're told of two things God's going to do about this great darkness problem. First, this coming light is going to, in some way, bring a new level of joy to God's people. Look at all the language that speaks of joy in verse 3. You've multiplied the nation, you've increased its joy. They rejoice before you, as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. And don't miss that lovely middle line. They rejoice before you. This will be a rejoicing in God, what God has done. This is, again, not just an abstract rejoicing. This is rejoicing before God because of what he has done to bring great joy and light into the darkness. It'll be like the joy of workers who've gathered in a bumper harvest. It's like the joy of soldiers dividing the spoil. These are the metaphors that are used here to try and depict this incredible joy that will be experienced through the coming light into the darkness. It's like the employee who's been given the news of a great bonus payment at Christmas. So God's going to do something about the darkness problem. He's going to, in some way, there's going to be light shining in the darkness, and it's going to bring incredible joy for those who are in the light. And the second thing we see then about what God's going to do about the darkness problem is that that coming light is going to shatter, ultimately, the fallenness and the gloom and the oppression and everything that goes with it. If you look at verses 4 and 5, you see, for the yoke of his burden, the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you've broken as on the day of Midian. Just this lovely reference back to when Gideon defeated the Midianites with a very small army of 300 men. And there's this little hint there. The coming light is going to bring a great victory, but it's going to be through what looks like weakness. It's quite striking. And then in verse 5, we're told that ultimately this coming light, this coming joy, this coming champion, he's going to bring an end ultimately to all unrest, all relational brokenness, all war and strife. So this really is incredible. There is darkness and gloom representing the brokenness and fallenness of the world. And here Isaiah is telling us of light coming into the world and into the darkness. That coming light is going to bring unmeasured, unrivaled, unparalleled joy. And in some way, this coming light is going to end the brokenness and end the fallenness. And so by the end of verse 5, you're thinking, right, well, how's that going to happen? What shape is the coming light going to take? How is God going to transform the darkness problem? And this is the third observation we're to make of this passage. We see that God's answer to the darkness problem, his invasion of light, is going to come through a child being born. Verse 6 gives us the surprising answer to the darkness problem. That answer is going to come in the form of a child being born and a son being given. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. I love how Ray Ortland has said in his commentary in Isaiah, God's answer to everything that has ever terrorized us is a child. The description then in verses 6 and 7 tells us so much about the greatness of this promised child. We're going to move into that more fully the next time. But I've set all that context up to bring us to this one little phrase after that opening line of verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and here's what I want us to focus on for a moment, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. If you just stop for a while and ponder that truth, it will, I'm sure, fill your heart with joy and give you a deep sense of rest. The phrase itself means that this coming child, this light who would invade the darkness, this coming child will have authority to govern and administer the whole world. He will have authority to govern the world to make sure that the purposes of God come to pass. He will be the highest power in the universe. He will govern for the good of God's people. Now, right now, our government are doing their best to help us navigate through the dangers that come with COVID-19. They're trying their best, but they are incredibly limited. They don't have all the answers. But this child who will have the government on his shoulder will have a governance and a rule and an authority that is unlimited. He is omnipotent. He is omniscient. He is all-powerful. He knows all things. He is not weak. He will govern. The full weight of God's governing the world will be on this child's shoulders. Think of that. The baby in the manger with the government of the universe resting on his shoulders. Now, I said that this fills my heart with joy, and it does so for two main reasons. And I suppose you could call this a broad application and then a personal application. I am so glad that the government of the whole world rests on this child's shoulders and not on the shoulders ultimately of the human race. The whole governance of the universe, the unfolding of God's eternal purposes, all the accomplishment of the counsel of God's will, it rests not on humanity itself by ourselves, it rests upon Jesus, the governor of the universe, the governor, administrator of all God's purposes. He is governing, he is working out the counsel of his will with absolute authority. The government that was on his shoulders when he walked on the earth is still the government that is on his shoulders now. So I'm so glad today that I'm not putting my ultimate hope in our local government, in a broader national government. I'm so thankful that my hope is not in a great political leader. Ultimately, it's not in a new president of the United States of America or anything like that. Ultimately, my hope is sitting on the governance, the authority that rests on Christ, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so I find that helps me to rest at the moment with so much turmoil, unrest across our world and uncertainty. The government rests on broad shoulders. And I just find that so wonderful. Second then, moving from that broader application to a personal application, I'm so glad that the governance and direction of my own personal life rests ultimately on the shoulders of this promised son and not on my own shoulders. Think of that in salvation, for example. The ultimate responsibility for me gaining righteousness with God doesn't sit on my shoulders. It sits on Christ's shoulders. That is so wonderful. The government is on the governance and administration of my salvation does not rest ultimately on my shoulders. It rests on Christ's. He loved us. He gave himself for us. He died. He demonstrated the fullness of his authority in life over death through his resurrection. And he has secured my salvation. It rests on his shoulders. And he gives that salvation as a gift. He is the one who has to see to it that his salvation purposes will not fail in my life. It rests ultimately on his shoulders. And ultimately then also in my Christian living, the ultimate responsibility for the direction of my life, for the cultivation of righteousness, for being sustained to the end, it does not rest first on my shoulders. It rests first on Christ's shoulders. He invites us to take his yoke upon us in Matthew 11, and he always bears the heavier side of the yoke. In Psalm 138, verse 8, we read, "The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me." And that helps me over and over again, that the government rests on Christ's shoulders in both my salvation and in my sanctification and in his directing my life, sustaining and keeping me to the end. So never forget in these uncertain days, Jesus is the answer ultimately to our darkness problem and the darkness problem of the world. The governance of the universe rests on his shoulders. He is the hope of the world, not a vaccine ultimately that will fix a problem that we're facing now, but we're going to face other problems in the future as well. But Jesus is the hope who gets right to the source and core of our deepest need. And I hope that just that simple line, the government shall be upon his shoulder, I hope that that will give you a sense of rest this Advent season with all the uncertainty, gloom and darkness that is around us now, like was surrounding the people back in Isaiah's day. This was a promise of hope, light entering into the darkness, a son being born, a child being given. But now we look back and we know so much more. than the people of Isaiah's day, and we can rejoice all the more in the multiplication of our joy through the Son who dispels our darkness, which is just so wonderful.